Well, good morning, everybody. Hope you're ready for a good study in the text of First Corinthians and the second chapter, or the 12th chapter. With us today is Mark Russell. Maybe Terry's here. I don't know. He's trying to decide his participation level. Um, we're going to be working hopefully through the entire 12th chapter. Mark, how are you doing today?
I'm doing better than I deserve.
Sounds familiar. Terry, how you doing?
Well, it's good to be with Mark this morning. That's what I'll say.
You keep flipping that video around. I'm not sure what's going to go on today.
Yeah, yeah. So, uh, before we get deep into the text, a couple quick reminders as to kind of what we've been doing. We're looking at the overall look of the text of First Corinthians. Second Corinthians comes into play as well. Paul's interaction with the church at Corinth, some of the history of that, some of the first century context, and mainly trying to find solid 21st century application from the inspired message of God to Corinth and to us. We've covered the first three chapters that gave a background insight into some of the spiritual challenges at the congregation there. We've also kind of taken a look at some of the other aspects of the history of the people of God generally. We move into chapter 4 through all the way kind of through chapter 10. We got some of the wisdom personified and wisdom applied aspect of Paul's insight. And then we were in chapter 11 yesterday, digging through a complicated text on a particular issue of the covering in regards to the worship of Christians as it moved into also their practice of the Lord's Supper. And now we're into chapter 12. So let's go ahead and hop back into the 12th chapter. Mark, why don't you read for us just to start with verses 1, 2, and 3 of 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter.
Well, since you boys use the ESV, I'll use that this morning as well. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, brothers, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to mute idols, however you were led. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking in the Spirit of God ever says Jesus is accursed. And no one can say Jesus is Lord except in the Holy Spirit.
All righty. So, kind of catching up on some of the back end stuff in the text here, there's an important couple of clarifications I want to make. Remember that the primary problem in the text is not whether or not these gifts are real, that they're actually engaging in spiritual activity. That's all throughout the New Testament text. Apostles, believers, disciples across the board engage in the intersection of holy things, unholy things, the intersection of the seen realm, the unseen realm, and God moves the ladle that stirs the cauldron regularly in that mix in the first century. The real question is how the believers at Corinth were responding to those spiritual gifts. I would say, at least in the outset of this text, that's the primary issue. At least for me, as I begin to think about it, because we already know that they are at times self-absorbed, at times class-based, the haves and the have-nots. They are at times destructive to one another in regards to all of these things, as they value things in very strange ways. They place priority on things that don't seem to make sense to me. So what do you guys see here in these first three verses? What's important for you there? What are you noticing? Mark?
Okay. Well, it seems that this has been a specific question that's been raised by them. Now concerning spiritual gifts, he says, and this was really in the preamble all the way back in chapter 1 and verse 7. He mentions the idea that this church was gifted in many, many ways. And it seems that they're bringing some of their baggage from paganism into the worship of the Lord. When he obviously is talking about mute idols, and they were supposedly led by these mute idols and the chicanery that was going on, whether it was a tube or a, or whatever that was supposedly talking in their things. But he says, you need to understand how this works.
Right. I think there is the conflict that is present in Corinth is a little bit kind of like going to a modern day illusionist magician. Once you know how the trick is performed, it no longer confuses you. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain concept.
Right.
The Corinthians, to varying degrees, had experienced that. The book of Acts shows some of that taking place, with Simon the sorcerer being an illustrative example of that, where we see him making his spiritual transformation between the so-called powers that he was familiar with, the legitimate powers of God. But there's one more conflict in this, that there is a legitimate spiritual tug on them. They're being pulled in that way. And so some of the things I think are important to catch is to recognize that these gifts here, again, genuine, but now desired out of context. Or as we've said earlier in chapter 11, and we see again in chapter 13, disorderly or out of its natural order, its God-given order, as they place undue priority on some of these things. Terry, something that you want to add here? I think we're going to get into verses 4 and following in a second, but what do we need to know about verses 1, 2, 3 before we go farther?
Oh, there's just this, outside of the fact that this is obviously a question they asked, and this is by the way, this takes up a significant discussion, right? I mean, when you compare the amount of space to this discussion to anything else, I think it takes up more space than any of the other issues that we see that's now concerning phraseology. I mean, it's essentially 3 chapters worth of discussion. So I think one of the things that to learn about that from this is just how at the outset, from us knowing that some of this stuff's difficult, but it was obviously difficult for them. Like, I think that's one of the things to kind of keep in mind. And yeah, there's this tug to the voiceless idols you once followed versus God, who you now serve, who I think one of the things that's a contrast there is kind of, hey, look, you served voiceless idols who did nothing. Now you serve a God with a voice who also gives you a voice. I think there's an intended kind of tie-in there through these gifts. And I think that's one of the powerful things to kind of see from these, especially verses 2 and 3 there.
Right. Paul is kind of pulling. Oh, go ahead.
I think the idea of saying Jesus is Lord, from our vantage point and in our application, we're a pretty homogeneous society and have been traditionally for a long time. But the idea of actually claiming his deity, his lordship as the only Lord is an imperative here that the Corinthians hopefully understand. But you know what? I'm not sure what they believe. I'm not sure how much they're grasping all of this, even though they've already been baptized, even though they've already claimed faith in Christ. And these next 3 chapters they're troubling to me from many different levels.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of taking the kind of the sanitizing film off of this, it's kind of difficult in some places for me to understand the day-to-day worship and what it looked like and what it felt like. But anyway, I'm rambling there a little bit. But
and let me say about verse 3. I think the greater takeaway for me is, confessing Jesus as Lord is not proof that you have a spiritual gift, right? Because we've all confessed that and we don't. But saying that Jesus is accursed was proof that you didn't. Like, I think that's one of the things to point out there, that's a statement that no inspired man would make, let me say this, not because he's not allowed to make it, but because the gifts he's received would be so confirming, he would never say that, I think is even the greater part of that. And at the same time, the person who has these gifts would openly confess that Jesus is indeed Lord because they have experienced this great side in that kind of sense. To me, I think that's what verse 3 is saying. Not that the Spirit gives a Spirit-led confession, but
Mhm.
because someone has those gifts, they understand Jesus is indeed Lord. And one who has those gifts would never say Jesus is a curse because they have the gifts, not because they're Spirit-led not to, because of what they know from having these gifts, what's confirmed through that. That to me, that's the power of verse 3.
Right. And so I'll kind of connect the pieces this way. Paul moves from similar statements from Isaiah 46, 9 and 10, the contrast of dumb idols. He makes similar allusions in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 20, to the legitimacy of the message that they're hearing, that what came from God and what they should be saying should be from Jesus. Again, he's talking back all the way to chapter 1 with the source and connection that ties them together. That leads into this perspective in verses 4 through 11. It opens up with verse 4. Now there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. I think it's a levered term there in verse 4 that is the unity of origin, because in verse 12 he's going to talk about the unity of the church. And so he's using a structure linguistically like a lot of preachers do. They have these same kind of repetitive phrases so we remember things. I think there's a similarity there. Terry, do you want to read for us a little bit, verses 4 through 11, if you could, right here, chapter 12?
Sure. 4 through 11. Hold on just a minute. Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For to one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills.
So the text here begins by making this layered separation of action. One source, separate actions to accomplish a team goal. That's kind of how I look at this segment of the text. I also will add that I don't believe that Paul is giving an exhaustive list of what the Spirit can do. He's giving a narrowed list of the various ways that the brethren at Corinth can connect what the Spirit can accomplish to what they know. And so some of the things that I try to kind of remind myself is that just because Paul says that it can work in this way doesn't mean that it always works through these various categories. God can do other stuff. The Spirit can do other stuff with men,
Well,
especially in context.
yeah, in Romans 12, there's another list of gifts given.
Yeah.
They're very different from this list of gifts. And while in this list in Romans 12, there in verses 3 through 8, it doesn't necessarily say from the Spirit, right? And I think we make a huge distinction, but these are God-given gifts. So I think one of the things is we make a dangerous assumption sometimes to go, well, this is all the gifts there were. I think there's many gifts. I think that's something we need to kind of focus on. And by the way, the comparison between what is said in 1 Corinthians and Romans 12, both of them, very similar writing from Paul, right? I mean, you change the list of gifts out, but I mean, very parallel. We're going to see a lot of those parallels.
You know, one of the things that's interesting here to me is it seems like the Corinthians they wanted to impose a hierarchy in the church. And there is some, but Paul and the Holy Spirit obviously are making a point here that the same Spirit, the same Lord, the same God. And I think it's interesting that he uses a Trinitarian approach here, obviously, because that's what the Godhead is. But he's saying the same Spirit brings gifts, the same Lord has offered service, and the same God has done this working. They're all one and the same. There is a unity here, and none of y'all are unified.
Yeah.
He's addressing the point right from the beginning. You serve a unified God with, and all three of them, if you want to differentiate the deity, all three of them are doing the same work. One is the Spirit is offering these gifts. The Jesus as Lord has offered his service, and you have the Father who is empowering everyone by his workings. And I think he's setting up a foundation here of y'all are doing this wrong, being so divided about everything,
Yeah.
including all of this working of God that's coming through you that none of y'all deserve.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that what we see in this text is they are obviously dividing over who has better gifts, right? This has obviously worked its way into the discussion of our group's better than your group, my preacher's better than your preacher, however you want to talk about the divisions that exist here. And so to me, it is a very obvious thing, as you're saying, that he comes in and what he's really saying from the very beginning, before he gets into this, wait a minute, unity is what this is about. You're members of one another is, hey, all these gifts y'all have that you're dividing over, they come from the same unified source.
Yes.
Like, how could you say tongue speaking is better than prophecy when the same Spirit gives you both? Like, why would you have that argument? The source is the same. It's not like, you and I can argue about Kentucky basketball versus Tennessee basketball, right? We can do that all day long. Like, I thought of you yesterday. Kentucky has, I think, the number 1 recruiting class. We were number 4. Like, I almost called you and I was like, hey, when did this happen? We're the second best in the SEC, right? We could have that argument, right? This is the time or place for that. But
yeah, we wouldn't argue about that.
Yeah, we would. We would laugh about that. But here's the point. This would be like you and me arguing about, if we were both Kentucky fans, about which player was better.
Right.
It's still the same team. Like, well, why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. And not only which player was better, but because I like this player, and I don't know any Kentucky players to use because I don't like them. But if I did, because I like this player, I'm better than you. Not just the player's better, but I'm better than you, Mark. I'm better than you. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
And that imposition of a hierarchy is something that I think has to be very human, because the disciples struggled with that. And they struggled with it all the way up to the week before and after, maybe even Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And this imposition of who's better. And yet I've had some Bible classes at times that folks ask, well, who's the highest in the Godhead? And I'm like, well, doesn't the Bible say they're one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think something
that
I noticed.
Different look. That's a different kind of conversation. Very hard to explain. And I recently had that challenge to preach on that, and it was the hardest lesson I preached on, to try to preach about how that ultimately, and this is the thing I would say, is we're 3-dimensional characters trying to describe deity that has exponential dimensions, like not even 4-dimensional, exponential dimensions. You cannot fathom that, right? So that's part of that here. But the overall baseline of this, before we get into chapter 12, and hopefully Phil has all his buttons figured out at this point, as we've kind of stalled for him, is in this section, what he's really saying is all these gifts are important. All of them have a purpose. All of them come from the same source. So later on, when he gets into this idea that, hey, the toe's not better than the hand, we can kind of see where this is coming from, kind of where it's building off of from that standpoint.
A guy gets an eyelash in his eye and doesn't want to have himself on the screen for 5 minutes trying to fix his ability to see, and all of a sudden it's button fixing. So
everybody in the chat saying, "Quit touching your face."
Probably.
Yeah, quit touching your face.
So that'd be blind. Those are the options at this point. In chapter 12, verse 7, I think there's an important kind of thing to think through, is that the way in which the Spirit is working at Corinth is so that they can all accomplish a spiritual goal together. It reads, verse 7 ESV, for the common good. And so your gift that God has granted you the access to utilize only has its full value, or maybe even any value, in that context. And when you take it out of that context, there's no purpose to it. There's no value to it anymore. I think Lee's correct in his comment there that they were coveting weird stuff. Like, I can do this, but you can do that. And so we've made that better than this. And I want this extra glory. And I say weird because it's weird to me, but to them and their culture, this is not weird. It's not weird to them in the degradation of their assembly, nor was it weird to them in the Corinthian context of the haves and the have-nots. Tim brought this up yesterday in the Bible study about the various ways that the Corinthians and the Greek culture would segregate based on value. That those who had better means, better power, whatever, they were served closer and more inwardly. Those who were on the outside, they were fully on the outside. I think it's a replication of that in regards to how this all plays out. You notice in the sequence of the things that they valued, the more immediate picture it became to being seen, the more they seem to want to have it. I want to have the preeminence of being the chief there, the number one whatever there in verses 9 through 12 in that context, verse 9 through 11.
So one of the things that I find really interesting, by the way, is take this back to 1 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3. Right. And when you think about the discussion there in 1 Corinthians 3, 1 through 3, which is all about this idea of their divisions. And he says there that they're still of the flesh, for where there's jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh and behaving only in a human way? And what amazes me in this whole section is how they took spiritual gifts and made them completely fleshly.
Yeah.
And that's really what he's setting up here.
And all of it, the end of verse 6 and in verse 11, all of it was energized by God.
Oh, yeah.
This has nothing to do with your value. This has nothing to do with anything that you've done to accomplish any of this. All of this is energized by God. And yet, what do you do with it? You do the very human thing with you value what you value despite what God values. And now I think it's interesting that later on, Paul does give a hierarchy. He says, here are the better gifts, and yearn and desire those better gifts, but you're not desiring it that way.
But the best gift isn't even in this list, ultimately.
Right.
I mean, you look the way chapter 13 ends, and it's like, hey, the thing that you should pursue above anything, not even in the list,
right?
Which is really interesting.
Keith brings in a comment too that and that's where we shift from first century to 21st century application. God grants gifts that are not, and I'll use this broadly, miraculous in nature, that we don't utilize as God intended. He talks about even though spiritual gifts look different now, this thinking can still creep in if we're not careful. Is it more prestigious to lead prayer or serve on the table? How about writing cards to visitors versus leading singing? Which has the stronger evangelistic impact? I can tell you writing a card to someone who's visited is a stronger evangelistic impact, which matches part of the context of 1 Corinthians verses chapter 11 through chapter 14, more than leading singing, which has an equal impact upon the offering we make to God. You think about what is your goal and your purpose? Well, if you want to grow the flock, you need people writing legitimate, actually writing cards. And Terry and I do this. We send out handwritten cards as the evangelist for the congregation where we're at. And
make my hand hurt.
I don't write that much. I write more when I do that than I do anything else. But we know that small service can make a dramatic impact to one person, probably more than the message that we shared with them.
And those gifts that Keith mentions are really more in line with those gifts from Romans 12 than the gifts here.
Right.
Because in Romans 12, you have things like exhortation and generosity and zeal and teaching and serving. And those gifts are probably more applicable to us today. What is really interesting is the same skeleton discussion of 1 Corinthians 12 is the same exact discussion in Romans 12. And except for here, he expands on it a little bit. I mean, I really think if you don't connect these two texts together, you're doing a great disservice to yourself in your study.
Yep. So let's scoot into verses 12. Right now, we'll just read 12 and 13, and we'll kind of walk through these next three sections of the text together. So, chapter 12, verse 12 reads as follows. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greek, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. This is the point where I think chapter 12 directly says, hey, do you remember what we began with at the beginning of the text? Do you remember what I wrote to you about your spiritual present tense condition versus who you were? Like, this is all looking all that backward space and saying, okay, let's draw it all together, because he talks about each of these categories of division early on. But what else do we see in the text here? What do you guys think is important for us to understand when we think about the one body and how it connects to Christ and all that he's trying to teach the church at Corinth? Terry?
Well, I mean, so the problem is unity and the lack thereof. And we get into this section of one body, but I really think what's really powerful is verse 13. And I think one of the fundamental things about understanding what is offered through Christ is that what Jesus has done is those who come to him, regardless of any background, culture, whatever, regardless of what you have, he strips that all away and makes us one. And makes us equal in that sense. You know, so much is said about equality today. I think that's one of the interesting things. So much is said about equality today. The only true path to equality is Jesus Christ. That's the only true path. You can argue and you can legislate. You will never accomplish through human terms, racial, gender, whatever equality you're seeking. But in Christ, we are all made one and all the same as in one in that sense. There's no Jews, there's no Greeks, there's no slave, there's no free. And I think that's one of the things to understand. Well, here's a group of people that they're arguing about all that stuff. They're arguing about who's better, you know. And while it may not be Jews versus Greeks, although I'm sure that did exist there some, or slave versus free, in this text, it's really, you know, this gift versus that gift, or earlier on it was Paul versus Apollos, or whatever it was. Strip all that away. Jesus died to make us one. Take all that stuff away. And I think that's something we kind of overlook as a part of the redemptive plan for man, is that equality that is offered to all of us through Jesus.
So I'm going to add one more thing. This comes off of a comment that I think comes from conversations with Terry and Mark to make application of the text. We joke around now, and it's because of the two of them, with the term, I love you and like you. And so Terry began the broadcast with, a similar illustration of that in some ways. I think what Paul is trying to help the brethren at Corinth achieve is to go beyond the generic I love you to genuinely like one another and interact with one another in a positive way and appreciate one another. I think that's the powerful application, the first century, 21st century crossing of the events, is that we do that we like and appreciate one another in a helpful way. Hopefully I represented the Mark argument well there.
Well, this idea, I think to Terry's point and to your point too, Philip, I think this has been we've kind of been vaccinated against this unity idea, because everybody just, we expect the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century that, we've been taught all men are created equal. Nobody believed that for millennia. Nobody. Now they may have kind of glazed over it at different points, but this is a radical idea that the rich people and the poor people are the same. But when Paul is writing to Philemon, when he says Onesimus is your brother, until he came into Christ, no master thought their slave was their equal. And we've, in America, we still struggle with this idea of who's better and who's worse, and you're a jerk and you're an idiot, and all the degrading things that happen. but that's not how it is in Christ. And after reading chapter 11 yesterday, you know, how do you, how do you mistreat your brother and still think you're one with him?
But think about that from a common 21st century application, okay? We struggled with this unity thing here because if we can't understand the unity of two people becoming one flesh in marriage and the permanency of that in our culture, how can I possibly grasp becoming one with 150 people that I meet with twice a week? I mean, I struggle with being, and I'm not saying me, but I'm saying generically, a huge segment of our culture struggles with being unified with the person they sleep with at night. Okay, let that sink in. And so now we're supposed to, and I just think there's something to that to understand. I mean, it's expected that we struggle with this. By the way, I think they struggle with that. I mean, and so it's a challenge from that standpoint. And in Jesus' day, hey, the whole question of, okay, well, who is my neighbor is evidence that this has always been a struggle, right? Okay, so I got to love my neighbor. Well, who is that really? Like, who is he? And Jesus said, no, you don't just love your neighbor. You gotta love your enemies too. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting here. But so unity is always going to be a struggle. I think that's really what you see is we're always going to struggle because go back to 1 Corinthians 3, part of being fleshly is strife and jealousy. It's just at the end of the day, those words of Paul that where strife and jealousy exist, you're behaving like mere humans. That right there is why this is so hard. Because we get out of the spiritual mindset, we sink back into just being men and just being like everybody else.
Well, to your point, I think while this is a conversation about miraculous spiritual gifts, this really isn't a conversation about miraculous spiritual gifts.
No, really, the conversation about that is really chapter 14. This, Phil and I talked about that before you hopped on today, I think, or maybe you were there. Chapter 12 really is not about spiritual gifts. It introduces it, but it's really about fellowship and unity.
Verse 14. Actually, Mark, do you want to read 14 through 20 for us, if you could?
Sure. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body.
So many layers to that one section.
Yeah. Well, and Paul, who does use other illustrations of value-based models, talking about worthy and unworthy vessels in other parts of his writing, here uses the way people engage in the world God has created to talk about the need for all these parts. One of the things that we sometimes tend to do with this text is to try to break it down into various layers, say, do all that. But what I'm looking at right now is just that general reminder of verse 14. It's a body thing. Like, it's really about seeing the big picture. And yeah, you can function with parts of it not running right? But how much better is it when it's all working together? Michael brings that point up with his comment there. Like, so much more is accomplished, and you are so much more as a body of believers when everyone's doing their part. I just cannot leave the big picture off the table as much as maybe I used to.
That's the Ephesians 4:16 tie-in, right? I mean, every joint has to come together and supply this.
I have to make a confession. As a bratty teenager, while studying this, I thought, well, who's the appendix?
Right.
Who's the one that we can get rid of? Now, I'm confessing that now because I have been around folks who have lost an appendix, and I realize that it is a very painful thing. But I don't want to be the person who would think, and I'm sure they were in Corinth, who are the expendable parts?
Yeah, and so in this text, right, there's this. So when I say layers, so the top layer obviously is, hey, this is a body, and I think part of that is God designed this to be a body, right? Not just that it's a body, but God designed it to be this way. Jesus wants you to operate like one unified body, and that means there's different parts. Now, what I think is really funny here is, yeah, there's that part of the immature of us goes, well, who's the appendix? Who's the big toe? Not that you can lose the big toe, but that's kind of the thing that goes through here. What I think is really funny is another one of these layers is just because the arm says he doesn't need you doesn't mean that's true. Don't listen to him. Like, and so kind of the answer to what Mark just said about who's the appendix is whoever the appendix is in that body should not listen to somebody telling them they're the appendix, because the overall part of this is we still need the appendix. Like, you're needed. Don't listen to somebody say you're not as much as valuable as they are.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of just convene the picture here. For me, it's not even about that. Like, we tend to hyperanalyze and say, like Mark did as a young teen, well, who's the appendix? And it's not even about that. It's not about who's the appendix. It's not about who's the arm or who's the eye. It's understanding that that is not actually the value-based measure. It's like, what can we do as a body? How
Sure.
strong is our body?
Yeah, and what I mean by that, Phil, is not that it's about that, but it is about, part of this text is, don't let somebody discredit your role in the body.
Yeah.
That is a definite application here. And the other part of this application is be content to be your role in the body. Like, that is part of it, but that's all tied into this realizing it is the body, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing is, you don't necessarily need to strive to always be something that you're not at the time. By the way, one of the greatest dangers is we're not content to be whatever we are within the body most of the time. And that's fueled by this kind of competitive nature to segment into parts and to prove our part's more important than the other, which goes back to your point that it's all one body. Be content to be the body.
Yeah.
And see it as that sense.
And we can grow. A friend of mine talked about one of the tools that helped him successfully navigate buds in the process to become a Navy SEAL. And he says, really simple, never volunteer for the jobs that are at the top of the list. Always volunteer for the jobs that nobody else wants to do. You'll learn more and gain more from doing that. And in the context of buds, if you volunteer for the top of the list jobs, they will make it 9,000 times harder on you, because it really is. You may not be ready for that job, but in the process of incrementally trying to improve and grow who you are and serve the clump, the lump, the body, the platoon, the church, taking those nasty jobs means that everybody grows, and you grow a whole lot more in doing that hard job that no one else wanted to do.
In reading through this and preparing for today, my mind jumped to Ephesians 1, where Christ is the head of the body, and then to John 13, where here is the master, here is the head, here is the Lord serving the body, and even washing Judas's feet. And this idea is, if they knew the Lord more, if they understood their place in the body more, they would understand that it's for, back to your point, Phil, from verse 7, it's for the common good.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about you being the top of the heap, not being the point of the spear. It's not about, any of these ideas, but it's for the common good. And that sort of communal idea is really against the grain, all the way back to the Gospels. It's, the locker room, who's the biggest, baddest, who's on the first team. I don't want to be on the JV. Those ideas are almost human nature. And Jesus is asking us, and the Spirit, even with spiritual gifts, he's asking us, don't be so concentrated, Terry, to your point, on 1 Corinthians 3. Don't be so fleshly in looking at it this way. You've got to get that out of your mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we need to jump Phil, in the next section, right? 21 through 26.
Accurate. What you read?
So you got that keyed up. You want to read that?
Sure. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow greater honor. And our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together.
You know, in this section, we really get to this idea, back to the idea of Phil's pointing out, it's a body, it's a unit, right? And so if you have a part that's weaker, you don't cut it off, you honor it more. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts of this text, is this idea of honoring the weaker parts of the body.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of ways you could take that. I think the overall, though, just top surface level is this appreciation for everybody. And the way this section ends, if one part of us suffers, we all suffer. Look, when, you know, think about it this way, when you hurt one part of your body, your entire body suffers from that pain and from that injury. And it affects everything. And so from that standpoint, we have to realize that's how this has to be approached. And again, it's going back overall to what Phil said earlier. This is a body thing. This, don't go too deep. This is a unit. This is a one body thing, Mark.
Right. One of the things that a lot of times it's easy to look at those who are escalating themselves and going to the top, but also there's also a condemnation for those who have devalued themselves. Well, if I were more talented, I would do more. If I had the talents that you have, I'm a less than a one talent man, to go back to Matthew 25. And what Paul is doing is he's looking at all of them and says, look, both of those perspectives, whether you're self-aggrandizing yourself or you're self-demeaning, both of these, there is here in the middle this idea of you're part of the body.
Yeah, and I think if we kind of like extend it in the context here, this is the body in absence of the head. Verse 27, it continues the thought together, and we'll probably read this text in a second. You are the body of Christ. I mean, it's really just kind of putting it together, and this is the point that I think is the drive home for me. When it says that, and when it kind of draws that final perspective to us, you're not the head. I think that's really the final application. Like, you're acting like you're the head and you're in charge, but you're not the head. And in all of those steps, Corinth began to physically behave. I'm the man. When no, they are not the man from Galilee.
Yeah, I think that's an obvious point here. In fact, that was a question Tim Beckley had in this illustration. Christ is not the head. Would he be the animus, or is that stretching the illustration? I would say stretching it too far. I think he is still the head here.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's part of the point. I think they were supposed to understand, it was understood that Jesus is the head of the body. And I think the emphasis in verse 27, let's go ahead and read the rest of the chapter because we are stretched on time. I'll start there if you want to pull that up, Phil.
It's up.
Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helping, administrating in various kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way. I think he emphasizes this body of Christ. We should still understand the head is still Jesus. I don't think we can remove him solely based on the language earlier about eyes and ears and that kind of stuff. I think that's going too far with the illustration. We have to be careful with that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting here, by the way, that he kind of deals almost this ranking system a little bit, right? And he talks about prophecy and teachers and all of that. Tongues is way down at the bottom of the list. Y'all notice that? Which is what's interesting is in their minds, that was like one of the greatest things ever. Like, hey, he could speak in tongues. And really, that's kind of the last thing. Tongues and interpretation was the last thing on the ranking list. And I wonder if that's truly because that's how it ranks, or if it's more Paul intentionally saying, hey, here's all this stuff he gave. Here's what you value the most. You need to understand that's not that important. I'm going to give you something way more important, which is going to lead into tomorrow's discussion in chapter 13 of the more excellent way.
Right. Verse 13 and key of chapter 13 is like the tie-in together to me. When he says, verse 31, chapter 12, and I will show you a still more excellent way, he is literally saying, pay attention to what's going to happen in chapter 13, particularly pay attention to what's verse 13 of chapter 13, in my understanding of the text.
And spoiler alert, in verse 31, he says, I earnestly desire the higher gifts. I don't think that means if you're tongue speaking, desire to be a prophet. I think what that means based on chapter 13 is faith, hope, and love are higher gifts than all this other stuff. We'll get more into that tomorrow.
So let's go ahead and walk ourselves around the horn in the text. Apologize if we've kind of gotten our balancing of textual investigation out of whack a little bit, but we're good. We're good. Everything's good. Mark, any last comments, things that you want us to know about, final sports analogies, ways to make Terry have a good day in the midst of whatever bad days? He seems to be in a little grumpy mood this morning. I kid. He's not in a grumpy mood.
I'm always grumpy.
Well, I will try to make his day better by not offering a UK reference. But one of the things that I think is clear in all of this, and just for a sum up and an application, is that, preachers sometimes can be self-important. And one of the things that we can't do is act like we're the head, or even as an elder, Philip, you and I both serve as elders. We cannot become self-important, and you're not getting me off task, Terry, even though that happened. The idea here is being a servant, loving, hoping, and he's kind of slapping him around a little bit without really slapping him around. And he says you're off-putting the Lord's way in so many ways, and I want you to straighten up and understand what all of this is. And the application for us is we are not as important as we think we are. And in fact, we don't need to be indispensable as a preacher, as an elder, as a husband, as a father. There's only one who's indispensable, and it's Jesus. And the sooner we grasp that and make that the bedrock of our service, we're going to do the Lord and everybody else, including ourselves, a great big favor.
Yeah. Terry?
There's a lot of things I could say. Love and like both of you. Let me throw that out there just for the record.
Love and like you, brother.
Yeah.
I appreciate you.
I think one of the things maybe to really keep in mind is that overall what this passage is really about is unity. And Jesus did not die as a sacrifice on the cross for us to be so divided. And I think we need to remember that. The other thing I'll say is this we talked about, somebody mentioned the parable of the talents. I don't remember who that was, and we talk about less honorable, more honorable, desiring higher gifts. In the parable of talents, just something for you to think about. The guy who had one was only expected to use the one he had. And the guy who used 5 was expected to use the 5 he had. But if you're the guy with 5, don't just use the one you like the most.
Mm-hmm.
Invest all 5 for the glory of God. And I think that's one of the things to take home. What's expected of us is to do all that we can do to serve each other and to glorify God and expand the kingdom. And that's our mission today.
And I forgot to say, thank you for having me on today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you stretching me technologically and putting me on the spot to make me study more. I appreciate you guys, really, in all seriousness.
And I have one more thing. We went to the garden 0 times today. I was prepared, but not once. I'm sure that will change tomorrow.
Definitely going to change at some point in the future because apparently it's a thing. So I really appreciate both Mark and Terry joining in for this Bible study. I know that all of us are trying to figure out how to adapt to the changes in our communities, the changes in our routine, the changes in our congregations. One of my encouragements to all believers that I would like to give today is to find a way to serve. Open up a door, go talk to your brother or sister in a new way, give them a call, just write a letter. The mail service is still functioning. Send out a card to someone you miss and tell them how special they are to you. God has given us the blessing of association and connection to one another, and I really think it's important for us to know that and to be involved in it in the best ways that we can. And whatever tomorrow holds, it'll have enough trouble of its own. But today has enough time for us to be good encouragers and to recognize and know that God has blessed us. And we want you to know that our encouragement is for you to find Christ, and may God bless you.